Okie Bluebirds with Niitaniko, and welcome back to my channel. So as a Native American social reformist, I always strive to make deep connections to other Native American social reformists, and by extension, I managed to discover the oftentimes varied opinions and perspectives within the Native community. While doing this, I've ended up discovering a lot about the Native community and Native people. Some of the things I've discovered have been heartwarming and relieving, but many of the other things I've found out about Natives is truly disturbing and profoundly disappointing. In this video, I'm going to be talking specifically about the disappointing discoveries I've made in my pursuit of Indigenous sovereignty. Much like my last few videos, where I discuss how fetishism, self-hate, and ethnic cleansing have adversely impacted the Native American community, I feel the need to provide a brief disclaimer. By no means am I saying that the points mentioned in this video apply to every last Indigenous person in existence on the face of planet Earth. For the most part, our community more or less has the same amount of sellouts as any other ethnic group, but what makes it much worse is that our population is distinctively smaller than that of other groups. So it therefore appears like we have an overwhelmingly large number of self-hating traitors in our community, which isn't necessarily the case. Also, like I said with the two preceding videos, if you are hypersensitive to the concept of someone opposing interracial relationships, especially when it comes to marginalized ethnic groups and Caucasians, spare yourself the inevitable emotional turmoil and just leave, because I have no intention to be politically correct about this. There are definitely issues that need to be addressed. This is one of them. And if you are Indigenous, even if you're Hawaiian or Indigenous Australian, many of these issues impact you personally. The topics in this video I mentioned are part of a comprehensive list that reflect the issues I've wanted to discuss for a long time. Issues that the Native American community desperately needs to fix. Some will include how Native Americans, particularly those who claim to be involved in social activism and reform, behave quite contrary to how I originally assumed they would. I'll also be discussing how Natives in general behave and interact with one another. But before this topic is discussed further, I would like to invite you to become a Bluebird if you aren't one already. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and follow me on my social media, including Twitter and Instagram. If you would like to support this channel, you may do so by becoming a patron through Patreon, where you can subscribe to a monthly membership for as low as $2 per month, or give a one-time donation in any amount. If you do decide to become a patron, you'll receive access to exclusive content, and when you get a chance, go over to my blog, and you could read up more on what the Blue Movement is, what the goals of the Blue Movement are, and you can sign up for the email list. The last thing I want to say before I get into this is directed to those who want to criticize me for calling out some of the many problems in the Native community. There's this brand of people out there who are going to say, Kutjal, you shouldn't publicly reprimand the Native community, or Native Americans are already very much underrepresented, and the rare time they are mentioned, you're saying something bad about them, and what have you. Firstly, if you were to actually take a moment and scroll through the videos I've created thus far on my channel, you'll realize that very few of my videos include critiques of the Native community. I've been giving the Native community a free pass on a lot of its normalized dysfunction, actually. But as I've mentioned before, a fairly recent ugly interaction with a particularly large and aggressive group of sellouts on Twitter caused me to seriously rethink this. The thing is, there are those within our community who don't want to be held accountable for their actions that literally impact everyone else in our community. They basically want to throw a rock and hide their hand, which is completely unacceptable. And really, even some of the problems that take place in private must eventually be openly addressed. So just know that, for the most part, I will call out Natives and those who claim to be Native. Now, let me start this video off by briefly introducing myself so that one may get a conceptualized image of who I am. My name is Kutjal, member of the Blackfoot tribe, descendant of the Wolf clan, and years ago, I had made the decision to dedicate my life to assist in the decolonization of North America and other indigenous lands. So I blindly jumped into the fight for indigenous sovereignty without knowing anything substantial about the Native community. I didn't realize the self-hate and overall hatred of melanation that exists among some so-called Native communities. Now, this isn't a representation of all Native people. I believe that only about, I don't know, anywhere between maybe 25, 35% of Native people think or behave this way. So it definitely isn't everyone. Still, that's a fairly large percentage taken into account our already small population size. What I've discovered while communicating with Native people is that there's an unfortunate disconnect between ideological solidarity and realized action. What I mean is, there are too many different opinions within a Native community about whether or not we should decolonize and exactly how to go about this decolonization. Now, anyone's first thought would assume that all Native Americans want stolen sovereignty to be relinquished, and that they all agree that the best ways to accomplish this would be to collapse capitalism, revive uses of our tribal dialects and cultures, and disassociate ourselves from those who refuse to, or whom are otherwise unable to, participate in such things. But this isn't necessarily the case. After only a few years promoting for my brand, and I admit that there's still plenty to learn since the learning process is always ongoing, I've realized certain truths, and sadly, many of these truths are very unpleasant. Truthfully, all Native Americans aren't reliant warriors who are willing to put their well-being and very lives on the line to reverse European imperialism. Truthfully, all Native Americans aren't recognizing the inherent dangers of interacting too much and procreating with Caucasians. Truthfully, all Native Americans aren't doing anything to get their tribal lands back. Truthfully, all Native Americans will not join in the fight against white supremacy and land sovereignty, either because they're too cowardly, lazy, or indifferent and broken to do so. And yes, I even understand that all Native Americans won't support me or my movement. And although these truths are sad, they're true. When I first got involved with the Native community, I immediately understood the necessity of building connections since I was essentially unknown, so to speak, and I knew I had to build my brand from scratch. In the process of doing this, I interacted on a constant basis with various natives from different backgrounds, and I discovered a lot. I also saw my preconceived notions about the indigenous community melt away, as they had been based on my own personal ideologies and assumptions of what I thought the Native community was rather than what it actually was in reality. The first thing I want to talk about is the lack of solidarity among Natives. Now, don't get me wrong, I've communicated with many Natives through email and my social media who expressed interest in doing collabs with me, who have retweeted my posts so that they get more exposure and attention, and who've even visited my personal blog site of their own accord. But what I'm really talking about when I say lack of solidarity is, well, too many different opinions. I know we live in a society that pushes the rhetoric that people having different views and opinions is a good thing, and whereas this can be beneficial to the creative process in the arts or in many other ways, what's always ignored is that this causes a disruption in society. If everyone in society agreed that capitalism should be eliminated, which it should, then homelessness, hunger, and vast socioeconomic issues wouldn't exist. And honestly, none of those problems existed in the Native American community prior to colonization. But when people within the same ethnic group don't share the overwhelming majority of the same ideologies, it causes people of that group to become defensive as an extension of distrust or to simply dislike one another because they don't have enough in common, and there ends up being division within the group. The same thing goes for families, or basically any group of two or more people. If half a family wants to live in the city and the other half wants to live deep in the country, there's going to be disagreement within the family. A house divided against itself will not stand. We know this. And although it's true that it's not possible for any team to have members who agree with each other on everything all the time, it can't be denied that having people on the same team who think similarly most of the time is undoubtedly very beneficial and efficient for that group. The same goes for an ethnic group. The fact that so many different mindsets exist within a Native community is actually very devastating because there's no way that can or will benefit us. Some natives want to be called Indian. Well, I don't because I'm not from India. I even had a native woman attempt to tear me down because I refused to be called Indian. But I won that stupid, brief debate in a very classy way, too. Some natives believe it's okay to make babies with the same group of people who don't even believe we're human enough to relinquish the land rights their people stole from us. If you've been watching this series, you already know how I feel on that matter. Some natives wholeheartedly support capitalism, while others agree that it should be eliminated. There are Native Americans fighting to obtain positions on Capitol Hill. And there are others who understand that Caucasians aren't ever going to allow us to use their system against them. What I've discovered while maneuvering through the Native community, both online and in real life, is that Native people lack a uniform code of behavior. Now, of course, we could ultimately blame this on Caucasians. Of course, this problem is most directly the result of Caucasian interference, including but not limited to forced government relocation, genocide, ethnic cleansing, and aggressive assimilation techniques. And then when you couple all this with tribal differences, personal issues at the family level, toxic tribes people who are in leadership positions, and those sad natives who've joined demonic groups and organizations in order to build connections or make a profit in the white man's system, it adds yet another level of difficulty to the situation. Still, and as harsh as this may sound, Native people must take a certain level of responsibility for the current state of our community. Because just as I've recently discovered myself, there are a lot of traitors in the Native community. For years, I've struggled to wrap my brain around literally one of the greatest mysteries in the history of the world. How Native Americans, after composing 100% of the North American population, are operating within a thriving, successful society, somehow went from that to being socially excluded from mainstream society and making less than 1% of the North American population. And now I finally know the answer. Sellouts. Caucasians didn't even know how to navigate the land, which is partly why the Sacagawea and the Lewis and Clark story is so beloved within the Caucasian community. There were Native Americans who literally helped the white man colonize us. And if you want further proof of this, just look at those natives today who are viciously defending Caucasians with their lives, while they themselves don't even own their own tribal land. Traitors among the indigenous community is one of the chief reasons why I'm sitting here even having to talk about retrieving my clan's tribal land. Now, by absolutely no means am I saying that what Europeans have done to indigenous people is acceptable. Genocide, colonization, ethnic cleansing, both physical and biological, forced assimilation, and sexual assault of a people on the other side of the planet who aren't even bothering you is completely inexcusable. Native American traitors wouldn't even exist if Caucasians had just stayed in their own countries. So by no means am I saying that what Europeans have done was appropriate or necessary or justifiable. And I'm also not making any excuses for Caucasians either. But Native Americans who betray their people must be held accountable. The thing is, if it was rare to find a pale-skinned Eurocentric person who claims to be Native, I wouldn't even be talking about this at all right now. But it's extremely common, too common. And the fact that there are Natives who are perfectly fine with the fact that we went en masse from being a melanated people to having blonde hair and blue eyes is literally my greatest disappointment in the Native American community. People can go on and on about how Asians are racist and colorist and this and that. And they are. But guess what they have that our people don't? Sovereignty of their own land. A language that has never gone extinct or been endangered. Even after various parts of Asia were temporarily colonized by the Japanese, their respective cultures and identity remained intact. Why? Well, partly because of ethnic solidarity. Now, I'm not going to go deep into that particular topic because there are many different factors at play, and Japanese colonization isn't the same as European colonization. But ultimately, indigenous people are the only group of people on Earth who are sitting on their own land for land rights. And don't bring up China and Hong Kong or any other Asian territory, because Chinese people taking over, say, Malaysia would be similar to the eunuch tribe taking over the Hawaiians. They belong to a different ethnic group, but they still fall under the indigenous umbrella, and it just isn't the same vein as white supremacy. Being colonized by Europeans is a nightmare and is far worse and brutal than any other form of colonization. Asian people, by and large, have sovereignty over their land. Koreans have sovereignty over Korea. The Chinese have sovereignty over China. And even in Africa, most African people at the moment have sovereignty over their own countries, although they have also been colonized. But what are Asians doing differently than Native Americans? They have ethnic solidarity. You can't just walk in off the street and claim to be Korean just because you love K-pop. Having the two distant Chinese ancestors in your bloodline isn't enough in and of itself to claim you are Chinese. Asians are still also the least likely out of all ethnic groups to marry outside their race. If Native Americans had greater ethnic solidarity, people would take us more seriously. Another major disappointment I have in the Native community is that some of us still trust the white man way too much. For example, how many of you took the vaccine? Not a lot of you, of course, but some of you did. A vaccine from a disease the United States government, not China, created, but that's another video for another time. I know, because we have to coexist with Caucasians in society, it makes it difficult to completely kick them to the curb. And for sociological reasons, we have no choice but to be cordial to them during direct one-on-one interactions. But there's a difference between tolerating Caucasians and merging with them and trusting them. Native Americans have absolutely no reason to trust Caucasians. Zero. This is why I'm confused as to why natives trust Caucasians for DNA racial breakdown results. Because they can literally make up results. It's not as if Caucasians are above lying. Lying is their specialty. Not standing up for ourselves, that's another issue in our community. You know how tens of thousands of black people have been holding protests for the Black Lives Matter movement? And you know how it gets the attention of the media? How come natives only have 5 or 8 people at the protests we have, and it barely gets mentioned on Twitter? Like I mentioned in my last video, lacking ethnic and ideological solidarity is a problem for the Native American community because it makes it easier for us to be divided amongst ourselves. I'm not going to be protesting on behalf of my tribe side by side with a Caucasian man who claims to be a member of the Blackfoot tribe. I'm not. And this argument about protesting was just an example because I actually don't support protesting. It doesn't accomplish anything, and it's ultimately controlled chaos allowed by the government. But one day I'll have to make a video on that explaining why this is the case. But the point is, it seems as if other people stand up for themselves a little bit more than we do. Another issue. More and more Native Americans are starting to let anyone come off the streets and claim an identity within our community. It's a real problem that needs to be fixed because Caucasians actually respect us even less because we do this. Mindlessly accepting everyone is indicative of a lack of self-respect, and honestly, no one truly respects someone who doesn't even respect themselves. Everyone subconsciously respects those who respect themselves. There are those who claim to be social reformists or social activists who cower away whenever they have an opportunity to voice an issue impacting our community. A while ago, I was going to start a lawsuit, and I wanted to see how many natives or people who claim to be native were interested. I interacted with about 30 people. No one even responded. And at least a third of the people I had contacted claimed to be Native social activists. Yet another thing that happens in the Native community among those who claim to be activists is the lack of representation and involvement. Do you know how rare it is to find a Native American YouTuber? Well, if you didn't know, it's really difficult. And when you do find one who claims to be a Native, they're really Latino or Caucasian, so our community essentially still isn't getting representation. You go online and there are literally thousands of black content creators, real actual black people who come from 2 black parents who are melanated and who are proud to be melanated. And when you do happen to find a real actual native online, regardless of the platform, they're not saying or doing anything of importance. And no, posting one video where you ran about the 4th of July isn't changing the reality of Native people or bettering our circumstances. It really isn't. At the end of the day, it's little more than a passionate rant. And when you look within the Black community or the Hispanic community or any other community, really, they actually use their platforms to bring about real social change. On YouTube specifically, there's a multitude of high-profile, well-known Black, Asian, even Arab content creators. But this can't be said for the Native American community at all. We are not shown in spaces where we can actually impact society. Now, I know that it can be argued that being represented through any type of media platform is pointless, but the main point I'm trying to make is that there aren't too many natives who seem deeply invested in helping our community gain more attention. The next thing I really want to note is the laziness some who claim to be Native American social activists have. I've tried to reach out to several of such people online and pitch the idea of implementing indigenous bartering, including to Nick Estes, who's supposed to be a big wheel in the native Twitterverse. Crickets. Nick never got back to me. None of the people I contacted ever got back to me. Actually, out of hundreds of people, only two supported the thought of our people using the socio-economic system of indigenous bartering like our ancestors. And they were both located outside the North American continent. And we couldn't think of a way to barter at such distances, so the three of us ended up just abandoning the idea altogether. Because after all, you can't start a bartering community with only 3 people. I know there are imperfections in every community, but if Native people don't start improving the many problems in our community, both us and our identity will become virtually extinct in 2 or 3 more centuries. We need to do better, seriously. So now that I shared with y'all just a few of my innumerable disappointments with the Native American community, what are some of yours? Again, no delusional comments allowed because delusional natives have absolutely impacted me, my family, and our community far too adversely. But with that being said, I'm Cut, y'all. This is the Bone Thread, and I'll see you all in the next video.